Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your test. A full textbook, tons of questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off. Now, let's get started. Today, we've got Sasha Chada from Ivy Scholars back with us. Super excited to have you back, Sasha, as always. And I'd love if you could introduce yourself for the people who haven't heard you before.
Thank you so much, Tyler. Love to be back on your podcast. Guys, my name is Sasha Chada. I am the CEO of Ivy Scholars. We're a candidacy building and college admissions consulting company. It's our job to help students become the kind of candidates their target colleges want to accept, then create amazing essays so they apply and get into their dream schools.
Yeah, fantastic. And today we're going to be talking about kind of one of the hot topics of the current year of our Lord 2024, right? Which is the new digital SAT, right? Which is digital for the first time. It's adaptive, and it has a little slightly different, like some differences from the old paper SAT in terms of how the reading comprehension passages are structured and things like that. So excited to dig into this and get started. So when you're talking to students this year and parents, and how does this come up, or what are you hearing as like kind of the main concerns from from students and parents about this, and how do you address those?
Parents or students are concerned that post-COVID, test prep and the SAT and ACT are here to stay. Most top-tier universities, from Georgetown to Yale to MIT, have come out to say, we want a standardized test score, and going test optional is not your best option as an athlete.
Hmm.
So I hear from a lot of parents and students who are worried that they've got another action item back on the menu and they want help adapting to a new test. Because the SAT is so preppable, because it's a test that really is as much a measure of how much effort you put into getting ready to take it, as much as the content you've learned in high school, most parents and students want to make sure they're ready for this new instantiation of the test and that they're going to be able to tackle the content in a way that's effective and shows their child's best qualities. So it's Ivy Scholars' job to make sure they're informed going into the test, both on structural concerns, how it's planned out, how much time each section takes, and what considerations one ought to take into account while taking the test, as well as the actual content of the math and reading portions.
Hmm. Yeah, so I mean, you just listed like quite a few things that I think would be interesting to talk about there, right? First is let's talk about the format of the test. I mean, it's kind of the easiest thing to knock out early, but it's also, it does kind of affect how you do the rest of your preparation, right? So, I mean, the big change is that it's adaptive and that it's a lot shorter, right?
Indeed, so it's been shortened by about 50 minutes, from about 3 hours to about 2 hours and 10 minutes. I think this benefits a lot of students. But before we get into that, I want to talk about adaptivity, because I see a lot of concern and confusion over what that word means. Families need to know there's two types of adaptiveness within the new SAT.
Hmm.
One is question level, that the questions you get will, the responses you make to the questions you get will determine the difficulty level of the questions you get after, within a single section. The second type of adaptivity is multi-stage adaptive testing, that your performance on one section of the SAT that you take earlier will affect what kind of questions you get in the next stage of the SAT later on.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing. I mean, the only exam that I know of that changes question by question is the GMAT, which is the graduate school admissions test for business programs. And that, I mean, I took that test. It kind of freaks you out, right? Because you get like a really hard question and you're like, oh, wow, I must be doing well. And then like you get an easier one. You're like, oh, no, I must have gotten that one wrong, right? And you're constantly thinking about it. So at least the digital SAT it only changes once, right? Which is the break point between the first and the second section of the same type.
Indeed. So the mind games within the SAT are now more intense than ever.
Mm.
I think it's very easy for students to get caught up during a test and second guess themselves, like you discussed with the GMAT. And one of my biggest priorities in our test prep program is to make sure that doesn't happen, because I think it's a waste of mental and emotional energy, and it's not focusing on the content, which is the best way to make sure you get through the SAT with the highest score possible. But to clarify for our audience, each test section, both the reading and writing and the math section, has 2 equal length, separately timed parts called modules. When you take the first module, if you get the majority of questions right, with a benchmark being determined from test date to test date, there's no fixed one, then you move on to the hard level module. But if you are below a benchmark for what College Board wants to see in your score for the first module, you'll only get the easy module.
Mm-hmm.
This is tough because the easy module is worth fewer points than the hard module. Unlike previous years of SATs, where all questions were weighted similarly, because the SAT's adaptive nature weights harder questions more than easier questions, it's now very easy, if you get a couple questions wrong early on in the SAT, to lock yourself out from making a top score in the high 700s or 800s.
Yeah, though I also think that it is important to note that like you touched on a little bit what the bar is for getting the hard second section, right? And you kind of need to get the hard second section in order to get a, call it a 700 plus score. Um, that bar is going to be different every single SAT because it's probably just going to be based on like weighting, right? And their assumptions of how hard the questions are for that particular round. So there's no like you shouldn't overthink it or over plan for it. And also, I mean, something that's interesting, right? If you like don't feel like the questions are hard in the second section, you shouldn't freak out and be upset that you have like the middle or the easy second section. Um, I think those are all the ways that are like common ways to get tripped up by adaptive tests, right? Like you said, it's like not focusing on the content. It's like getting worried about, oh, like, where am I? At the end of the day, I think that if you kind of let go of all of that and you just focus on getting things right, that'll still be the best path to a good score.
That's more true than ever, especially because the SAT is closing on being more of a sprint than a marathon.
Mhm.
At just over 2 hours, its time's been cut down by about 30%. So students who get fatigued over time, students with ADHD, students who might not have gotten a good night's sleep the night before or a good breakfast the day of, or just students who don't concentrate well for 3-hour blocks of intense questioning are benefited more by this new format. Now, this means there's fewer opportunities for students to make kind of silly or careless errors, the kind where you might transpose a number in a math problem or read a reading question too fast.
Mhm.
When you've got fewer questions, there's fewer opportunities for those mistakes. Simultaneously, having fewer questions and a shorter amount of time means that every question is more critical, which I think increases the pressure and the stress of the exam day even more.
Right. I mean, I think when the shorter SAT came out, everybody, like on the student side, all the students were really excited because they're like, oh, it's going to be easier, it's going to be shorter, right? But like you said, because it raises the stakes, maybe it's not, it's like more intense, right? I mean, it's easier in the sense that like maybe test fatigue is not playing as much of a role as it has with the longer tests, but that trade-off is that, if the denominator of the equation is getting smaller, that means that any missed questions in the numerator are going to have a bigger impact.
Indeed. And for students who are performing at a high level, I've noticed a trend in which when students are sitting through too many questions that are too easy, when they, for example, feel like they've gotten the easy section even though they tried their best on the first section, very often we'll see an increase in trivial mistakes, because these questions aren't really a measure of ability, they're a measure of attention. And attention and focus are much easier to disrupt than mathematical or critical reading knowledge. One of the things I prep all the Ivy Scholar students for when they go into the SAT date is to stay focused, not on the implications of what they've gotten right or wrong thus far, but on answering every question as best as they can. Now, simultaneously, the structure of the test and its online format does afford them a couple opportunities I think are really worth noting. One is that you can preview upcoming questions. The other is that you can mark earlier questions and go back to them later if you've got time. And the third is that there's no penalty for guessing. So when you combine these three things, that you can look ahead, you can go back, and it doesn't hurt you to guess, it gives you more of a chance to give your best effort at a question, and I advise students to think about questions for about 30 to 40 seconds to get an answer.
Mhm.
And then if you feel like you've got a halfway good answer, I tell students pick the question and answer you think is best, and then move on if you need to. Maybe if you feel not too confident about it, you can jump back to it. But keep a steady momentum going through this test
Mhm.
because time is not on your side.
Well, and that's like, I mean, even at the ACT, I think that's another big challenge. All these tests use time as one of the ways to kind of make the test more difficult, right? Um, if you had, unlimited time, I feel like people would be much closer to getting perfect scores on all of them. And I think that at the end of the day, the best thing you can do has with time management is to be really good, I think, at like what I call like triaging problems or diagnosing problems, where at a minimum, if you see something and you know that you don't know how to do it, just like moving on quickly rather than wasting time there. But also trying to, figure out what the problem's really asking and then, using that to help you jog your memory and your notes and things like that.
I agree, Tyler. Triage is a fantastic term for it. I particularly like the markup functions on the digital SAT. You can flag questions to come back to, cross out answers within a section, highlight pieces of the problem. So if you were skipping between a lot of questions very quickly, it's easy to find your notes on what you were thinking about the question previously, any answers you've eliminated, and come back when you finished all the questions you're 100% confident in, and ideally increase your confidence levels to 20, 40, 50, 75%.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, if at least what I used to do on the GRE when I was preparing for that is I would actually blow through every question I didn't know how to immediately answer, and then I would go back. Right? So if it was like, oh, I know how to do this in 30 seconds, I would just do it. But otherwise, I would just like skip it that quickly and then just move on and then come back later. I don't know if that's maybe too extreme, but the idea is like you can have multiple strategies for approaching this.
I agree, and Tyler, I like your strategy. I think a little bit of ruthlessness with yourself and the test on test day is important. That kind of candidness where you say, okay, I wish I knew the answer to this, but I'm only 50% confident I know the answer in this. So let's triage. That's the right way to handle a test like this.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so other than like, some tactics and time management, I mean, let's talk about kind of how the content of the test has changed. I think the biggest thing that happened is probably in the reading and writing section, where they basically made it so that instead of reading one passage and answering five questions about it, every question has its own very short passage. What do you feel like is the impact of this change? Is this, easier or harder? Do you feel like students today are going to be better off or worse off for that?
Students who are stronger in the humanities, who are good at reading long passages and retaining details, or scanning for details quickly, will generally be better at the old format. But students who are used to searching for information and providing an answer, I think a skill that's more important in the digital age when the necessity of finding information fast gets greater year over year, those students will be advantaged by this new focus of the SAT. I think that's great for students who've got ADHD or who have decision fatigue, especially on test day.
Mhm.
I also think it advantages students who are used to testing tactics over long-term searching. For example, students who don't read a ton of novels, who don't read a ton of long passages, but who are used to short-form quizzes that demand quick question and answer responses, those students benefit the most from the new SAT.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I'm curious then. Like, what are the other things with the new SAT that you wanted to talk about? I mean, did I miss any changes on the math side?
So on the math side, I'm really happy about a standardized Desmos calculator.
Oh, right, the
Um,
calculator. That's kind of important.
so in terms of equity, nobody's got to pay for their own calculator anymore.
Hmm.
In terms of practice and making sure your practice simulates the test day effectively, that calculator is always accessible online, so there's never any worry that there's going to be a different model on the test day or that you might run out of batteries. I think this is especially important for our students with dyscalculia and or dyslexia, because minimizing surprises and getting them very used to the format of the instruments they'll be using can help a lot, both in reducing anxiety and in increasing
Hmm.
performance.
Well, and it can also, and I really like what you said about leveling the playing field for sure. I think it also is, there are some types of math questions where it seems like the Desmos calculator can just kind of do it for you. if you know what to do, right? So it does give you an avenue. And like the thing is, ironically, sometimes the calculator is going to take longer than just like doing it in your head with the ways that you know, but it still gives you another tool that you can leverage to do well in this section.
Indeed. So, on that note, I would like to let our audience know there's about a 90% correlation between paper and digital test scores. That 10% difference, I think, is mostly characterized by improvements of the test. With regard to the difference between the SAT and the ACT, one truism I heard a lot is that the ACT used to benefit students who thought less deeply but more quickly. And the SAT would benefit students who could process more information at once, who could handle larger multi-stage problems, but it was slower. When I talked to College Board last year, the information they gave me was that university professors that they reached out to with questions about how to reformat the SAT to better match what freshman and sophomore professors for undergraduate institutions needed from their
Hmm.
students, what they heard was that while in the old days students might use whole text blocks to answer a question, most professors want students to be able to quickly scan arguments and look for flaws or look for evidence to support an argument. So the kind of short form answer format used on the SAT, I think is topical and is contemporary with what professors want to see for students in their freshman and sophomore years. I think this is a move in the right direction, and that 10% difference in correlation may be a 10% improvement.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting.
I I'd also say this new SAT feels a little bit more like the LSAT. It focuses a little more on construction of arguments, matching claims to evidence, identifying what would strengthen or weaken an argument. While reasoning skills and overall analysis are still in play, it's gotten tighter and more focused, which I think benefits students.
Yeah.
I'll also say, I think all of us are used to using Control F or Command F, the find function on our computers,
Hmm.
to find details within text passages. While that's not an option on the SAT, it's not nearly as necessary as it was. I used to, on the older versions of the SAT, try to teach students to scan to really quickly find the evidence they needed, and I find that just sifting through text to zero in on one piece of evidence is now less important than knowing how to interpret the evidence in a smaller text block, which I think is more of an intellectual skill and less of just a reading speed skill.
Right. Well, and it's also it means that the questions can be more focused on like what, the passage is actually trying to say or whatever, and not just be focused on like, what was the reason that Bob, said this, and you just like have to go like check a box. I mean, in general, I think the SAT is built pretty smartly. And I think that what they're trying to do, like, I think that they wanted to reduce the length of the test. So they very intentionally, like, kind of went out and, like, sought out ways to do that. And it being adaptive, I think, is the key way that they can get away with that. And then also, on top of that, I think, like you said, they wanted to, like, reshape the questions and sort of the vision of the future. And it's really interesting that professors don't want people to read long text anymore. But maybe they're just being
I would,
realistic.
I would, I take a different perspective on that. It's still important for students to read long texts, but that's something you do in homework, not in class. And frankly, College Board or professors in universities don't have control over that. That's all about students and how they respond to the academic challenges they're given. What is important is that when you're sitting in class and you're given a source, you can quickly break it down, analyze it, draw your conclusions, and be ready to support an argument. And I think the new SAT is better at testing that. I also think the granularity it gets with adaptiveness helps distinguish between high performers. I think the old SAT was great at distinguishing between, say, an 800 score or a 500 score. But when it comes to the difference between 760, 780, and 800, I think that's more apparent because high performers will get all the easy questions right. Low performers will generally get most of the hard questions wrong, but in this new adaptive SAT, you can keep tweaking the level of difficulty until you've teased out the difference between 740, 760, 780, 800, and you get a clearer picture of the kind of student that you're really receiving from this test.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting because, the GMAT basically did the same thing. And, the debate is like, who asked for this, right? And like, and sorry, just for context for you and for everybody else. The GMAT, what used to be like, a 750, which is out of 800 points and a very, very strong score, like top 1% or 0.1% in the old GMAT. Now there's a new GMAT, and that 750 has basically become 700. So it's like doubled the distance between a 700 and 800, if that makes sense. And hopefully now I'll get out of being too deep in the weeds. But basically, that's what the GMAT did. And then the interesting thing was like nobody wanted them to do that. Like the colleges didn't want it. Like they just felt like making it really, really hard to get a perfect score. Do you feel like the SAT had in like they wanted it to have more stratification at the top for a similar reason, or what do you think about that?
Yes, there's been a fight every year against rising SAT scores that diminish universities' ability to discriminate between students who are great and students who are exceptional. So College Board has made the SAT harder with every iteration.
Hmm.
And I think, well, this might not bring joy to students' hearts. I think this is overall good for our educational system because it helps us determine who's qualified for what programs.
Yeah,
I
well, and I
also
think it
think
also is.
it lets
Oh,
students
sorry, go ahead.
I also think it lets students play towards their strength. That some students will have a greater ability to perform on a smaller set of questions. For example, fewer geometry, combinations, permutations, long math word problems means that students can focus more on studying content and less on studying form or interpreting how the SAT wants them to answer word problems. I think overall, this at least offers the opportunity for a big improvement because students get to focus more on executing and less on interpreting.
Right. Yeah. What I was going to say also following up on that is that, the increased stratification does have the benefit of a really high scores is becomes that much more special. And, the whole one of the reasons why Dartmouth and other schools have gone back to requiring tests is because they felt like without it, they were missing that opportunity to identify really, really smart students in kind of maybe weird situations, right? Maybe they're valedictorian, but at a pretty lowly rated public high school, or maybe like it's not that their grades are amazing, but just like, they weren't very motivated or whatever it was, right? So it gives them the ability to like kind of having more stratification at the top of the test makes it so that the people at the very, very, very top stand out more. The thing that's interesting, and so that is all, I guess, like useful. But the thing that makes me curious is, do you feel like the rumors that the bottom of the test, like that it's gotten easier to get a mediocre score? Like people that used to get a 400 can now pretty consistently get a 500. Have you heard that as well? Because I've just heard that from a few people, and I'm curious if you've heard that and what you think about like the reasoning behind that, if it's true.
That's a great question. At Ivy Scholars, unanimously, about 70% of our students are focused on Ivy League or other top tier schools. I don't work with a lot of students who've got SAT goals lower than, say, 650 to 680 per section.
Yeah,
So when it comes to performance, between 350 and 600, I'm not a good guy to ask those questions. One thing I have heard that I think may be of interest is somewhat topical to this question is about students who are losing points specifically because of cultural issues or cultural bias.
mm,
So we've worked with a lot of students from China, India, Singapore, Hong Kong, and while these students are all fluent in English, there's little idiomatic differences in these countries that
totally.
many students commented the SAT was not terribly fair to test on. One example I dealt with 2 years ago was a question in which wanted to pick the best phrase between advantages outweighing drawbacks or defeating drawbacks. I think to conventional American English, the former, that an advantage outweighs a drawback, is relatively obvious. But because these words aren't always used the same way, I think if you're learning English, especially if you are learning it in a more formal and less vernacular setting,
Hmm.
defeating drawbacks also sounds technically correct. It doesn't have an inherent grammatical error. It's just an idiomatic difference. I think reducing the number of idiomatic questions does a better job at showing students ability as opposed to their just their culture and their background.
Great. Yeah, I also think that it's very, I think that it's also like the more that tests can avoid testing idiomatic differences, the better, right? I mean, this is supposed to be an international test, but it's testing the English language. And yes, of course, they're going to be speaking English in college in the United States, right? So it like makes a certain kind of sense, but also, not everyone who takes this test grew up in America speaking English their whole life.
And when we test on English, we test on punctuation, verb use, pronouns, making sure ideas are complete within a sentence, discrete questions, which ought to be preppable. I think the problem with idioms is they're really not very preppable.
Hmm.
They're the kind of thing you pick up casually from your parents or your friends or the media. So I think a new way of testing that's focused more on discrete and concrete features of the English language as opposed to coincidences of idioms is a superior approach.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, vocabulary still provides a ceiling. And one of the biggest challenges I see for our international students is making sure they built the vocabulary necessary to understand everything being said in SAT passages. The fix for that is the same as it always has been. Students need to read lots of English language material, scientific material, literature, newspaper articles, to make sure they're familiar with the forms in which these ideas get presented.
Yeah. Well, and also to make sure that they're just like like you talked about vocabulary a little bit, right? Like I think you just will absorb vocabulary sort of naturally by reading other things like that, right? It's why people say, oh, when you're preparing for the SAT, you should read the New Yorker or the New York Times or things like that, right? I think that definitely can help.
Exactly. Two more comments here.
Mhm.
Um, One is that while I don't see a ton of students who are looking for scores in the 350 to 600 range, what I have heard is that these students suffer less test anxiety because they're getting a consistently easier question. And I think students in that range can enter the SAT understanding they're not going to get every problem right and being very okay with that emotionally. I think this makes the SAT less stressful overall for students who are looking for mid scores.
Yeah. Well, and I think that was the goal, right? I think that they wanted, I think like both with making it shorter and with the adaptiveness, I think their hope was that they reduced sort of the I don't know how to put it. I guess the fear of it. So yeah, it's good to hear that you're kind of hearing that as well.
I think the SAT and ACT involve so much of a mental psychological game. They are such a sprint in which students have to achieve such a high focus state for a very short period of time that anything we can do to reduce student anxiety, especially for students who aren't shooting for top scores, is good and healthy. The other point of anxiety I heard mostly from parents when the SAT was going digital was what happens if the internet turns off? If there's some interruption in power or in Wi-Fi or internet access. The good news here is that the SAT, is that College Board specifically, has built a Bluebook app that does seem fairly robust and functional. I've heard almost no reports of lost tests or data corruption or the kinds of problems we fear when we shift from a paper test to a digital test, which I appreciate. I think that's a successful technological transition, and I commend College Board for being able to pull it off.
Yeah, I've heard like occasional, like, this test center, like things got screwed up. Maybe the internet went down. But in the grand scheme of transitioning, 1.5 to 2 million people a year to a completely digital system for the first time, I feel like they did great. Error rate was very low. Um, well, great. Anything else you wanted to cover on this topic before we wrap up today?
That's it, Tyler.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Sasha Chada from Ivy Scholars. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me and use the code podcast to get 10% off if you like it.